No ensaio Machines Are Digging, de 2008, é assim que o filósofo iraniano Reza Negarestani define o conceito que dá mote ao tema do Festival de Arte e Tecnologia Index 2022, Superfície. Como limites, as superfícies não pertencem aos objetos que concluem morfotopologicamente. Estão no meio, como interfaces entre duas entidades contíguas. Esses interfaces podem ser utilizados tanto de acordo com seus respectivos objetos para fins táticos, transportes, atividades furtivas, fluxos, etc., ou em linha com os potenciais que podem ser acumulados a partir das superfícies em geral entendidas como plataformas de atividade e zonas de emergência e efetuação, manipulações estratégicas. As superfícies aparecem aqui como espaços de contorno, mas também de potencial de ação. Zonas liminais, de contacto e de fluxo, membranas que não limitam, mas que se apresentam como espaço sensível de transmissão e de passagem de informação. Zonas que se densificam e se transformam em teias, juntando ao imaginário filosófico de Negarestani o do antropólogo Tim Ingold, numa breve passagem de um ensaio onde nos propõe Uma Breve História das Linhas, editado em 2013. No preciso momento em que o demónio se pousa sobre a superfície do labirinto, a superfície deixa de o ser, e as linhas que pensamos terem sido traçadas sobre elas tornam-se os fios que armadilham o demónio, como se numa teia de aranha. Pousemo-nos então nas superfícies que alguns dos artistas presentes no Index 2022 nos prepararam. O excerto da peça Synopsis Seriation 2021, que ouvimos no início deste podcast, é a resposta do músico Florian Hecker à pergunta que fizemos, a ele e a outros artistas que em comum têm o facto de terem produzido peças especificamente para esta edição da Biennale Index. Como é que a tua prática artística em geral se relaciona com esta noção de superfície dada por Negarestani? O coletivo Berru, fundado em 2015 e sediado no Porto, constituído por Bernardo Bordalo, Rui Nó e Sérgio Coutinho, com formação nas áreas de artes plásticas, multimédia, cinema e engenharia, começou por responder a esta questão a partir da relação do seu trabalho com a experiência do interface.
Fizeste quando falas de interface, isso é uma palavra que nós discutimos bastante aqui. O que é uma interface, a ideia de interface, e as nossas peças acabam sempre por ser um interface, eu acho, ou pensamos nas peças como interface
onde a vida acontece, onde a comunicação acontece.
Como é que tu te relacionas, quais são os pontos de tu perceberes a peça e como é que a peça te percebe a ti e qual é a interface entre a tecnologia e outras cenas. Eu acho que nós temos sempre isso, o nosso trabalho acaba sempre por estar relacionado com, é sempre...
Eu acho que mais do ponto de vista ecológico, de preocupação com esta camada, porque na verdade é a zona onde, claro, o planeta é uma zona gigante e nós temos só uma faixazinha e é nessa faixazinha que a vida toda acontece. Ou seja, a importância desse sistema e dessa forma podemos relacionar. Eu acho que tipo, o que nós estamos a desenvolver neste momento é tipo formas de armazenar energia e formas de expandir essa energia numa performance. E é isto que ainda estamos muito longe de conseguir. Ainda vai ser provavelmente uma coisa super desconstruída disto, mas tipo é neste... É aqui que nós estamos, a nível...
consciência.
Sim, tipo, do que é que nós estamos a pensar para novas peças.
Interessa-nos se calhar que tipo público experiencie de facto alguma perda ou algum gasto claro e objetivo de energia. Por isso é que estamos aqui a tentar pensar em formas de, em primeiro lugar, armazenar energia através de algum tipo de tecnologia. Estamos aqui a testar algumas coisas.
Armazenar ou já? Estou a falar de já?
Armazenar primeiro para depois despendê-la.
Primeiro estamos a criar energia.
Primeiro a coletar.
Primeiro tens que gerar energia, depois tens que armazenar. E nós queremos fazer estes dois pontos de forma biológica, ou de que forma é que, utilizando a natureza, conseguimos encontrar meios que nos permitam fazer isto de forma fácil. E agora, uma das questões que nós temos é de que será que nós conseguimos, nós achamos que sim, já temos visto alguma coisa, alguns documentos na internet, de transformar energia eletrostática em energia elétrica. Só que essas são as questões de sempre, que são energia, são sinais muito baixinhos, como é que nós conseguimos armazená-los? Porque tipo, tudo está cheio de energia muito baixa. Se nós conseguíssemos arranjar uma forma de a coletar, se nós conseguíssemos captar a energia de tudo, era
E estamos até a olhar
nós
para o oceano.
Nós temos tipo uma batata, não dá para acender um LED, mas 20 batatas acendem um LED. Então é um bocado. Ora bem, será que conseguimos carregar batatas e descarregá-las? Será que conseguimos usar essa energia das batatas para fazer alguma instalação acontecer, alguma performance ou alguma peça ou alguma construção de uma peça? Então estamos neste ponto de que forma é que nós conseguimos criar, armazenar e despender e mostrar o gasto dessa energia, quase como tu observares o gasto de energia, mas ele vai ser tão rápido, não sabemos, mas pensamos ser rápido, então tu vais ver a mutação da peça e o que fica é o resultado desse desperdício de energia, desse gasto de energia.
Então, voltando à tua questão,
desculpa,
eu acho que a forma tipo, assim, mais direta de relacionar é uma preocupação se calhar básica com esta critical zone da superfície.
Jana Winderen interessa-se pelo espaço ínfimo que se gera entre a superfície da água e o ar, de um modo que exprime um fluxo contínuo entre o interior e o exterior dos corpos. Na sua investigação artística atual, dos corpos de insetos que habitam este espaço intersticial.
I am very interested this exchange, particularly, of course, between the surface of water and air, and oxygen, and the oxygen, in the blood, and how it goes like into the body of the insects, for example, how they use this bubble to breathe with, like a mechanical lung. I want to kind of look into this really small scale of the interaction with water and air, I think, and what is happening with the oxygen exchange into the body of the insect, and if this has anything to do with the sound production or not. I don't think I will kind of find any solution on this, but it's just to look into, to learn more about some kind of weird sound there. Where is it? Okay, sorry, no, it was my it's my own work now. Sorry, it's just coming out of the computer. Because also, in the work, listening through the dead zones that I'm working on for ICME, for Helsinki at the moment, I am thinking and trying to understand more about the dead zones and the lack of oxygen. What happens when there isn't any oxygen in the water to breathe for the creatures, and it dies. And these particular insects are also depending on the oxygen levels in water. And all these questions that comes out, around oxygen breathing, the warming of waters, what is happening around the plankton, zooplankton and phytoplankton, and also these small insects, they are using water. It must be a bit complex what I've said right now. I made too wide, but it's because, of course, in this particular one, I want to look into how underwater insects are using this air bubble that they bring underwater, and what happens of the surface of this bubble, with the exchange of oxygen.
Para Peter Burr, artista visual norte-americano residente em Brooklyn, Nova York, cuja prática incide no recurso a técnicas de animação por computador, desenho e videojogos, as superfícies surgem quando, ao desenhar sistemas complexos de jogos de computador, emergem breves e talvez frágeis ocorrências de sentido e significado no meio de movimentos de grande energia e turbulência computacional.
Well, I mean, I guess like on what level you're interested in kind of thinking about that, because there's a lot there. When I think about, like, there's a technical way that I can answer this, Luís, and then there's also like a conceptual way that I can think about this.
You can answer both ways.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with I was having trouble sleeping last night, so sometimes I watch. And I'm really into this video game called Noita, it's Finnish for witch, where it's this procedurally generated video game the tagline is every pixel simulated. The idea is that it's this really kind of interesting interaction-rich video game that is totally computational, totally randomized, but it has these rule sets. And so as artists or as designers, something that I find really interesting in thinking about that critical zone is that, like, part of, like, as I play more and more of this game and watch more and more of this game, you start to really understand where those critical zones of systems interacting create something. Maybe it's fun. In video games, we'll talk a lot about, like, things need to be fun. Maybe it's novel, maybe it's beautiful, or maybe it's like conceptually rich. Maybe it feels political. That when you're designing these systems, I sort of think about a turbulence displacement. There's kind of all these energies that move on these lines, that there are these critical zones where conceptually your system, like, it's a tool that when I make video games, when I make films that engage with systems, you're kind of playing with it until you find that really delicate space, right? That critical space where it's like, there's all this stuff that doesn't work, but then there's this little sliver that does work. And so kind of conceptually, I think about surfaces as, like, you can, when we are working with any complex system, so as a technology artist, we can work with real time, we can work with video, we can make installation, I think it is really interesting to be thinking about those critical zones where you can ignore, right? You can ignore most of what the picture is and think about those interactions. And so then I guess, like, technologically, thinking about, I remember when we were first talking about some ideas for what this festival might be, and we were kind of talking about, billboards or taxi signs, or, like, where are all of these places in which we have this really specific type of technology, video technology, that has it speaks to advertising typically, right? Like, that's what that stuff is there. But is there a way that we can kind of subvert that and use that to do something else? Something that I do want to mention, like, in thinking about the modernist or the abstract expressionist painter, is, like, in thinking about that kind of formal cohesion. As a video artist, I really like thinking about what these screens are actually made out of. And so thinking, physically about surface, I do find it really interesting to try to reflect and meditate on, like, what this material actually is, and make work that, so if it's supposed to be this kind of crappy LED screen that has all these aberrations, that you kind of work with that. Or if it's a really crisp, low-res LED screen, you can work in that kind of way that allows you to understand these things as physical objects, not just that hole where we can fall into a fiction or fall into a story.
Para o músico, artista visual, construtor sonoro e cênico Jonathan Uliel Saldanha, o encontro com o universo de Reza Negarestani deu-se já em 2017, quando preparava a peça O Poço, que então apresentou no Rivoli Teatro Municipal do Porto, e surgiu no seu trabalho artístico com a força de uma mudança de paradigma.
Eu acho engraçado falar mesmo, esse texto é um texto assim fundador para mim, e aliás fiz uma peça lá em 2017 muito baseada nesse texto, que era O Poço, que era precisamente uma peça sobre a superfície à volta de um buraco negro. a peça era sobre uma ausência e aqui os pontos de atividade era toda a periferia dessa ausência. E na realidade eu sinto que desde aí até agora continuo muito interessado e aí eu sinto que houve, diria que à volta desses anos, uma espécie de mudança de paradigma para mim, na minha forma de operar. Sendo que sempre me interessou muito dinâmicas ontológicas e por isso trabalhava com grandes sistemas cibernéticos aplicados a coros e coisas que tinham a ver mais com esta procura de uma espécie de profundidade. E essa profundidade pode ser vertical, é para baixo e para cima, uma espécie de veículo. E de repente, nessa mudança paradigmática e muito operada por esse texto, sinto que fiquei muito interessado em perceber como operar as coisas de outra forma, ou seja, como é que de fora para dentro consegues operar, como é que pensando precisamente qual é quase que o resultado epidérmico daquilo que tu fazes, como é que isso informa o pensamento se calhar mais, não quero dizer mais profundo, porque acho que a superfície é tão profunda como o interior, mas diria que quase que a superfície informa a articulação da dimensão ontológica que queres projetar. Porque senão há uma veiculação do ontológico para fora que depois pode rapidamente tornar-se altamente crítico, autorreferencial, circunscrito a uma cultura ou uma narrativa. E quando na realidade começas a operar a partir da superfície, ela informa-te mais uma vez a partir de paradigmas culturais, estilísticos, recursos visuais completamente distintos. E eu diria que até a partir dessa altura comecei a introduzir cor de uma forma muito mais agressiva nos meus trabalhos, usar cor que eu diria que até nos panoramas daquela altura poderia quase ser exagerado ou agressiva, mas como é que de repente, sei lá, a feira popular ou o carro tuning te informa sobre um death drive e não necessariamente o bataille e uma caveira, percebes? E como é que se queres falar desse death drive, não tens que necessariamente mostrar a caveira, mas podes mostrar a superfície de um carro prateado, estás a ver? E quase que o Chrome fala melhor da caveira do que a própria caveira. E essa mudança paradigmática para mim libertou-me de imensas coisas e deixou-me um terreno muito mais aberto agora para realmente estar disposto a mudanças radicais naquilo que é o meu trabalho e aquilo que são as minhas próprias propostas, ou seja, que elas não vêm já embutidas, sei lá, era como pensar que de repente tudo aquilo que eu fizesse fosse filmado em películas a 6mm e de repente pensar, não, de repente a imagem digital é em si uma coisa, eu não tenho para fazer um filme artístico usar 16mm, porque isso vem também com uma carga e com um discurso que não sei se é aquele que eu quero veicular e interessa muito mais criar a ruptura e perceber o que é que a imagem mais básica pode me dar do que necessariamente usar tropismos que são associados, e isso me mete para a primeira pergunta, tropismos associados a um certo tipo de validação da arte, e que na realidade esses sim parecem cada vez mais uma superfície, ou seja, porque não há uma dialética entre a superfície e o seu interior, e de repente quando operas a partir da superfície, inevitavelmente há uma dialética muito mais libertadora e que pode produzir objetos muito mais avassaladores, até para mim, ou seja, que ultrapassam as minhas próprias medidas estéticas. Percebe? Por isso, menos confortáveis, menos dentro de uma circunscrição, uma narrativa cultural ou uma narrativa contextual.
Da experiência epidérmica que nos informa sobre profundidades ontológicas à epiderme da Terra, finalizamos este podcast com o testemunho de Matthew Biederman e Piers Warnecke, cuja participação no programa artístico do Index 2022 entra em relação direta com o impacto dos planos de extração de lítio projetados para a região de Montalegre, não muito longe de Braga, um tema ao qual voltaremos no próximo podcast.
In the proposed quote by Nigaristani, he says, surfaces offer tactical, logistic, and strategic instantiation of movement. And then he goes on to say that they stand as interfaces between two contiguous entities, which can be used in line or with their respective objects, or not. And I think it's interesting, and I didn't read this quote when we first started working on the piece, but we kind of were on that path in some respect with some inefficient signals with the previous project, because we really were looking at this idea of the relationship between nature and culture, between pre-human natural world and our sort of impact on it, and how it's divided and how it's sort of split up, and whether those two confronting spaces really are confronting or are they simultaneous, and how they cohabit or not. I think it's pretty clear today that it's not a very healthy relationship. But I think we were interested in looking a little bit further, through actual documentation, cameras and sound recordings. So we were sort of on this idea of two opposing spaces from the beginning. This quote makes sense for me, at least in terms of my artistic approach of the musical composition, because one of the things that I started working on was this idea of, okay, we have two opposite sort of states here, and how do they touch, and what is the border between them? What is the surface between them? Is it just like a straight cut? Is it a gradient? Is it sort of a slow fade between the two? Do they exist simultaneously, one on top of the other? I think all of those can be true. You can think about any natural space and sort of human cultured space, and you can see those together. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to portray that musically. So I thought about transitions, and I thought about how you transition from a state A to a state B, whether it's a linear thing, whether it's a series of cuts, and I drew out a bunch of different ways that you would transition from a state A to a state B, and how you work between the two of those. So that was sort of the basic idea of the composition, of the compositional strategy in this piece. And the two states were not just silence and noise, but I tried to sort of think about as many different kinds of opposing states as I could, whether they be tonal versus atonal, rhythmic, arrhythmic. I mean, there's not much rhythm going on here, but I tried to have a little bit of that. Working with Supernova Ensemble from a distance was interesting because it added a very clear element of acoustic instruments, which I don't necessarily work with. I use mostly electronic sound sources, and so that added a very opposing state to what I'm used to working with. So but at the same time, we didn't really want to make it okay, state A is electronic, state B is acoustic, because otherwise then we're maybe adding too much value to one of those. Maybe if the acoustic is tied to natural images on the screen, and then when we transition to destructive images on the screen, and that's electronic, then maybe it's too it's too much of a loaded sound. So I tried to avoid that, but it did help to have all these different categorizations of sound between harmonic and inharmonic sounds, or electric and acoustic, or pitched versus unpitched. So that was sort of the sort of compositional basis behind the piece, and what I used to work on each section.
I think that spillover relates to the idea of surface that Reza discusses in his essay. In a way, it relates in that we're looking at the Montalegre region of northern Portugal, where there are these intense pressures to develop a lithium mine to that would take over a space that has been formerly used for ranching, and in fact has been used for ranching for so long that there's an indigenous cattle there that doesn't exist. This kind of line of cattle doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. It's also been a place of community cooperative ownership of the land that can be used as an example of kind of a indigenous understanding of the land itself, rather than a site for extraction, which is globally is going on all over the world, especially as there are increased pressures to move away from kind of petroleum-based energy sources. And however, this energy source, a green energy source, still requires some sort of extraction from the land, whether it be something like lithium or cobalt, which is mostly pressured in Africa. But we see mines and extraction everywhere all over the world, and they're always put in places where most people don't see them. But unfortunately, there are people who use the land in a much more holistic way. And these kinds of understandings of the land, something that can be used, a way that the land can be used in a way that's responsible and ethical, I think needs to be recognized. And so I think with spillover, we're trying to look at these two alternatives, and that, while the green energy push is good to get away from petroleum, we still have to understand that there are impacts within that. So I think in terms of like surface, we directly use the surface of the land and the landscape to, at least visually within the piece, kind of illustrate these two functions and kind of these two. Well, one pressure from a large international corporate entity, which has the government's backing, because of course there's money to be made by everybody involved in this, as well as the way that the ranchers and farmers have been utilizing the land there, which hasn't changed it, and ironically enough, just nearby, and also a reason why the mine could potentially work there is a massive dam. I think it's created one of the largest drinking water reservoirs in Portugal, which would be under immense pressure as well because of the processing of lithium requires an immense amount of water to process. But you're already looking at a landscape changed by man, by humans, because of our population and population density, that this reservoir was required and dammed. I mean, as an artist coming from Quebec, I can say that every river in Quebec has a dam on it now to produce so-called green energy. But everything is not without its impact, and I think with this whole green push and greenwashing, we oftentimes don't, it's spun in such a way that you don't consider the other side of the coin of the impact that, even if it's so-called green, there are impacts. And I think that's kind of the complexities that we are looking at, and maybe not such a direct way with the work, but it's a reflection of these kinds of complexities and where we sit in this, Anthropocene or early post-Anthropocene, as we're led to believe. But this is kind of what we're looking at with spillover. So I hope that comes through in the work. Our visit to the Montalegre region was very important. You know, it was very necessary to actually go there and kind of walk around, get a sense of the landscape, understand where the mine will be placed, where the processing plants will be placed, should it all become approved, as well as talk to the people who will be directly impacted by that. I mean, and in fact, there'll be an entire hillside wiped out. There are two towns, Rebordello and Carvalhais, which formerly and currently you can't see one from the other. Should this mine happen, an entire hillside will be destroyed, and two ancient towns, villages that had a hill separating them will suddenly be able to wave to one another, which is kind of wraps up in a very concise, precise way exactly how big this impact of a mine actually will be. And, you know, to be able to walk around and talk to some of the activists there and hear directly from them their perspective on why it should not happen there, and to learn a bit of the history of the land and its uses is much more valuable than anything you can glean from newspaper articles and books and things like that. So it's absolutely crucial to talk to people involved, people on the ground, people who are struggling against this. And I think it reflects similar situations globally where these are happening, where these intense pressures are happening from governments and multinational corporations, places like Thacker Pass in Nevada in the United States, or in the Atacama Desert in Chile, where local people's opinions and use cases of the land is not valuable in the same way that there is hard ore or that can be removed. But, you know, someday, at some point, all the lithium will be gone. And what will happen is there'll be a giant hole in the ground that, you know, can maybe be pushed around a little bit. But that lithium will be gone, the jobs will be gone, the land will be gone, and the way that people who were formerly using the land responsibly for hundreds of years won't be able to use the land anymore. And so all that's left is a hole with nothing else, and maybe you know, some Teslas driving around. And so we need to think very carefully about how we want to see our future and how we want to see the Earth in the future. And that's kind of what, you know, part of what we learned by going there and talking to people on the ground.
I mean, I think along with the visuals with Matthew, we wanted to, you know, from the beginning, look at natural space versus transformed space. And so, you know, one of the ideas that really worked into the project quite well from the beginning was the idea that this is a natural space that would be potentially destroyed, really. I mean, transformed is kind of light, that would be an entire mountain top being removed and dug down to remove lithium, mine for lithium. So I think from the very beginning we've been thinking about, you know, how to show that. Easily, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is, you know, contrasting the existing land and the existing space through aerial photography with transformed versions. But we tried to think of other ways to look at the space as well as it exists now. Thinking about what's underneath the land that you see, what's invisible. Obviously, this is a lithium mine, so, you know, there's the idea of this space of resources that's under the surface, that's not really interesting for the people who live there necessarily. I mean, water underneath the surface, the land surface is interesting, and perhaps there's a few things in the ground that are interesting, but the idea that there's this overlap and interest and in definition of a surface, of a space, that for farmers it's land on the surface, it's grass, it's how much water has there been, versus someone, a company who wants to exploit what's underneath the surface, what's in the ground, is extremely contrasting, and it's not even really the same definition. I mean, it's like having two complete definitions of a single thing. But it also, I think, was important for us to try and just show that a surface always, or has the possibility to have two different definitions that are coexistent, or more than that even. I mean, they could have multiple definitions. So there's a section in the piece where we switch between microscopic views and sort of more macro pulled out views, and try and show them at the same time. I think it was important for us to try to look at different ways of seeing and defining a surface at the same time. And sonically, that was a challenge for me. It's, I think, somehow easier to sort of show something up close and something from far away visually. So sonically, it was a bit of a challenge. Does it mean adding sort of field recordings so that we have a up close, kind of more granular, texture-based sound that goes with the up close shots, and then far away? I mean, the easy approach would be sort of echo or reverb or something like that, but that sort of places the sound in a larger space, which I don't think is what we were looking for in this case. But we came up with a good solution, I think, together. So that's one example of how we sort of worked with the separate spaces and separate definitions of surfaces through the piece.